Hello and welcome to another episode of, I guess this is Killing the Church still. You know what it is we do here. We talk about doctrines and things that need to be killed in the church and things that are killing the church. Tonight, though, is sort of a series that we're working on called the Sects Talk, where we're going to go over the different sects of first century Judaism and talk about things that are important to know going into and why this is necessary for studying the New Testament, understanding the context of what's happening. So tonight we got a special episode for you guys because this is an episode that a lot of people ask for, and so will next week's episode. So we're talking about the Pharisees, and we're also going to talk about contrasting them with the Sadducees. So this is sort of a 2-for-1 episode, but with a primary focus on the Pharisees. And part 5 of the Sects Talk, which is still a special yet to be announced what that one's going to be about episode, really going to focus on why we're going over some of these details. So hope you stick around for that. Anyway, as per the tradition, let me welcome my compatriot Bradley to the show. How are you tonight, my friend?
Doing wonderful. Glad to be here. Glad to be doing this. Work was crazy. So I'm very happy to be here right now.
Well, I was going to say, the day's basically over. You're here now. All is right with the world. You're on the correct side of the screen. And I don't know about you, but I too have had one of those kind of days at work where I was just really looking forward to sitting down, talking about some theology and history, and sipping some whiskey. So what have you got with you tonight?
Still doing the Maker's Mark with the French oak staves, but I got a new beer that I'm trying also. Well, not really trying. I've had this before, but I really enjoy it, and that is the Sam Adams Cherry Wheat. Very good. Very good.
I'm still doing the Shelby Company Limited
Nice
Prohibition recipe. I really, really enjoy this whiskey. I need more of it. I'm not going through it very fast because I love it so much. I want to savor it, so I keep saving it for basically just tonight. But that's a fantastic whiskey. Definitely goes in my top 3 for sure.
Absolutely.
So, a couple of announcements before we get started, as usual.
Yep.
This episode is brought to you by our lovely Heretics, our top tier Heretics. A special shout out and thank you to all of you. We really appreciate all of your donations. May Hashem bless you abundantly for your generosity. We really appreciate it. Couldn't do this without you guys. And we have more things coming down the pipeline because of your guys' support. And yeah, very excited for the future of this company. And so a couple of other things to get out of the way real quick. Speaking of our supporters, the monthly book giveaway this month is Besora by Mark S. Kinzer. And if you want to enter into that book, you can become a Patreon supporter and you will automatically be entered, or you can join and become a paying member at alternatemedia.com. Membership starts at just $1. And this is this book, actually, I love this book. It's a very, very good book. I recently read it. And it is, so we just started, basically I just kicked off a new book club, more or less. If you want more information on that, go to our Discord. I just dropped an announcement in the announcement section of our Discord, linked in the description below. And the Besora book is March's book club book of the month. And so whoever wins that will basically have the book ready. So if they want to do the book club with us, they can read it with us for the month of March. And on the last Thursday of every month, I will do the review. We'll do it live, so that way I can take all your guys' questions and give you guys my personal thoughts. And the book club is sort of a way to get everyone, I guess, not to get them, but to read 12 books for the year with the alternate media guidance. And they're actually meant to build upon one another. One book will build on the last book. So anyway, this month, January, is Restoration by D. Thomas Lancaster, a really good starting point. Again, more information on that in the description below. Go to the Discord, check out the announcements. I just dropped it a little earlier this day.
Yep. In the name of a book giveaway, now that we are into the new Gregorian year and looking forward to the spring holidays once more. Get ready, guys. We are putting together another bookshelf starter kit for our annual Purim giveaway-thon.
We are giveaway-a-thon.
Giveaway-a-thon. Yep. And I had so much fun with it last time, and I can't wait to do it again this year. Hopefully, it's a little bigger and better this year, and I think it's going to be a spectacular time.
Yep, and it will be a very different bookshelf starter kit from last year. In fact, it may not even be correct to call this one a starter kit. It might be a different type of bookshelf giveaway, but it will be a bookshelf giveaway, but probably like a bookshelf complimentary set. Something like that. We've got a couple of books already in the lineup, but keep your ear to the ground on that announcement.
And also look forward to next week on Tuesday. Yes, the 10th. I'll be doing my interview with Inspiring Philosophy, which is going to be a spectacular conversation. Just coincidentally, the subject matter is something that I've been pouring a ton of research into lately for an article that should be going up on the website shortly. Still pending peer review at this point. And as soon as it gets past the peer review, it's going up on the website, and that will be awesome. So it'll be cool to be able to sit down with Mr. Michael Jones and talk about the Book of Enoch and Genesis, and we may even discuss the calendar issue a little bit.
I am looking forward to that. I'm actually looking forward to sort of meeting him too, because I've only ever interacted with him on TikTok. But so I think that's it for the announcements. Once again, everything is available on our website, alternatemedia.com. That's ALTAR. alternatemedia.com. And also same for the Patreon. We keep those up to date simultaneously, but we are slowly moving everything away from the Patreon and into the main website. So, and the book club will be done on the primary website. There's already a book club tab for it. So if you want to join us for January's book club this month, I think it's January 26th is the last Thursday of this month. And then we'll do the book review. I'm actually super excited. So I am, and I'm not excited because at the same time, that means I have to read double the amount of books I would normally read. I usually only read like one book a month anyway. So I picked books that I've already read. I'm going to reread them so that I have a thorough understanding just for you guys, on top of my regular reading schedule where I'm reading a different book. And so I'll be, you know,
well, you're doing what I'm doing now, because I'm already reading through David Wilbur's Remember the Sabbath, because he and I will hopefully be having an interview about that subject and Torah apologetics and that book. So far, it's a spectacular book, by the way. Would recommend. Especially if you know anybody who's struggling with the issue, or like, you know, this is a good beginner and introduction to defense of the Sabbath. But I also had another friend who is in the process of writing a book drop off just the beginning of the manuscript, and so now I'm reading two books for two friends now.
Well, I mean, yours are different. I'm reading major books, but again, don't get me wrong, I love reading books so much that this was sort of like, oh no, whatever.
Woe is me. I have to do the thing.
Oh darn! I gotta reread my favorite books.
All right. Topic.
Anyway, let's jump into this topic. We are talking about the Prushim, the Pharisees, the who, the what, the how, the when, the where, the why,
those
the everything.
bad guys.
And interestingly enough, before we even begin about talking about the Pharisees, we actually sort of have to go all the way back to the Hasmoneans and the Hanukkah miracle. Actually, that's actually where we start to see the Prushim, the Pharisee party, kind of emerge. Now, this episode is not dedicated history to the Pharisees; it's more of a theological overview. So I'm going to keep things incredibly brief here. And when I say brief, I mean like very, very brief. there was a time where Judea becomes a unique nation after the Maccabean revolt, and the Hasmoneans officially take over. This actually takes a while. This is another couple of decades after Hanukkah before it actually really kicks into its own unique government. And when the government is finally put in place in Judea, they reestablish the Great Sanhedrin, and they kind of go back to a First Temple period style governance, which yields a sort of two-party system as a result of that. With the Hasmoneans actually sort of leading the charge because they have the high priesthood, and they are sort of forming the government back together to the best of their abilities. And they have signed a peace treaty with Rome. So we're talking it's 150 BCE, give or take, when all this happens finally. So two things happen. You can't have anything other than a two-party system. Like, even when you have a majority of a particular party, that majority party will eventually split into two different factions. That's just history for you. It's how it always happens. And so that's where we have actually the Sadducees and the Pharisees kind of come into existence around about this exact same time, one in opposition to the other. Now that we have a fully functioning governance and a peace treaty with Rome and all sorts of other things going on, you're going to have diverse politics. Yeah. So really, really quick overview. Something that I want to say that is important to keep in mind moving forward. And don't forget, everybody, please drop your questions in the chat should you have one. This one's going to be a fairly complex subject, so please grab your pens, your notebooks, and drop some questions if you need them. I may brush over a subject too quickly, so just maybe slow me down. But something to keep in mind moving forward from this point forward, understand that we tend to think of Pharisees as being a strictly religious sect of Judaism. It is not. The Pharisee party is more like a political party with a heavy concentration in religious values than it is a strictly religious sect. And where you fall on the politics versus religion line in this day and age will sort of determine where you sit on the Sanhedrin, if you're a member of the Sanhedrin. But yeah, think of the Pharisee party as being more like a religious political party, because we're dealing we're dealing with a system of governance that is based on religion, but is also a political entity. So
it as bad as the comparison may be, it is kind of like the evangelical Christian church in America. As much as they would like to think of themselves as a strictly religious entity, the amount of political power they have in the country is absolutely undeniable. And so it is therefore also an entity of heavy political influence.
Yes. And it was the Pharisees were sort of an up and rising thing already, especially, and with the Sadducees too, during the peace negotiations between Rome and the up and rising city of Judea, becoming its own standalone sort of city state with a powerful region. And the Hasmoneans elect themselves into the high priesthood, which they actually legitimately are heirs to. They are one of the three possible branches for the high priesthood from the sons of Aaron. And believe it or not, yes, even the high priesthood has three different parties, essentially. Politics gets really ugly real quickly. And so, but the Hasmoneans are one of the legitimate branches for the high priest, because, it just has to be a son of Aaron. It doesn't have to say which son. So there are actually three possibilities over time.
Yep. So
they also become priest kings, which sort of becomes a problem, and they start conquering land and nations. They start conquering land and being more expansive. And so that gives rise to some opposition from religious authorities, because the high priest should not be a king. Plus, the king will inevitably come in contact with dead bodies in a time of war, which a high priest is not allowed to ever do. So there's all sorts of problems that creates, and it sort of sets the stage for a lot of politics on religious issues. So think of the Pharisees and the Sadducees as being more like a politic party rather than a strictly religious party. We're dealing with a government that uses religion as its primary form of government. So it is a religious party, but it acts as a political party. That's very important to keep in mind moving forward. I can't stress that enough. In fact, that part is so much more important than the rest of the information that we're going to go through, because it shapes the way you understand the rest of the information we're about to go through. That we spent like 10 minutes talking about it.
I was going to say, it's simple enough when you understand the fact that Israel was essentially a theocracy, right? Mm-hmm. And as a theocracy, church politics is politics.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of a little bit of background. So there's other things to consider real quick. Official Pharisees, like party members, they usually refer to themselves as Hevarim, were recognized positions of authority. They would be called rabbis by other people. And they're actually uniquely the party that does this, by the way. It's one of the things that sets them apart from Sadducees is that the common people call them rabbis, which is not something the Sadducees were known for being called.
That's an interesting thing that we'll actually go a little more into something we'll be discussing later, because of the first person recorded in history to ever be called rabbi. That has its own implications with the fact that it took over the Pharisee movement.
It certainly does. So that being said, though, every town and community, this is a very quick overview of the structure of the government, because again, we're talking about politics essentially, so it's important to understand the structure. There would be every synagogue acted as a civil court. Right? Synagogues had a lot more authority back then over the people than they do today. Today, it's seen as a center for worship and worship only. They don't really actually exercise any civil authority over people. But back then, this was not the case. And you had a tribunal of essentially Pharisees. Well, not every region, Pharisees or Sadducees. You'd have a tribunal of head teachers, rabbis, Sadducees, what have you. And they would delineate for small case civil stuff going on at a very local level. And then regions, the land of Israel was divided into 70 major regions, and each region had its own court system called a Lesser Sanhedrin. The Lesser Sanhedrin, all members democratically elected from individual communities, from different, think of this like American politics, like you have your regions, you elect your representatives, and the Lesser Sanhedrins of their area would handle higher court cases, but not exactly Supreme Court level cases. And the Lesser Sanhedrin would then elect a single representative from their Lesser Sanhedrin to the Great Sanhedrin, which there were 70 members of, plus a president, so 71 total members. And the Great Sanhedrin, as it was called, is the Supreme Court. So think of it that way. And every member is a representative from a particular region.
Yeah, I was going to say like a state Supreme Court versus the federal Supreme Court.
Yeah. Almost. Precisely. Yeah. And the Great Sanhedrin would usually only convene on major holidays because that's when everyone would be in the area. So basically 3 times a year, more or less. And that's actually why we see in like Tractate Sanhedrin of the Talmud that most capital punishment crimes would be dished out on holidays, like Passover, because then that's when they would be meeting. And so they would hear these cases. And so if it would ever be brought to a death sentence, it would usually happen on one of these major holidays. So that's just kind of the structure. So think of that. Because understand, once again, this is all politics. So these local leaders are members of a particular party, and they represent the small person. They win over their votes. They get put into a position of authority where they can have act as a representative, and democratically elect members from within their lesser Sanhedrins to the greater Sanhedrin. This is all very much like a representative republic style. It's actually loosely based on a Roman republic, because the Hasmoneans were familiar with Roman governmental systems. And so some of this is based off of that, but by and large, a lot of it comes from obviously the book of Deuteronomy and Numbers, where this system is put in place by Moses. But what's interesting, like this is a weird quick fact to history. The interesting thing about this is that the Hasmoneans set up this system despite it being tradition, not because of it. Like they put the system in place and then they realized, oh wait, this is basically how it's supposed to be done anyway. Like little fact of history. So I know that seems like a lot of nothing, but yeah, one question. So what took place in Matthew 26:57 was the Great Sanhedrin? Yes and no.
Half.
It was half of the Great Sanhedrin, primarily because they wouldn't hear these cases on the holidays, around the holidays. They wouldn't be doing capital offenses on holidays. We'll actually talk about that towards the end of the episode, why only half of the Great Sanhedrin was probably present at Jesus' trial. But for now, let's press on. So, 22 minutes in, let's go.
Put a pin in that.
Basic information: the Pharisee stronghold, like where a lot of them came from, is from the Galilee, actually. There are many Pharisaic schools up there that they had a strong foothold in the Galilee region. They had won over the populace in its entirety, basically. And so when the Hasmonean Empire took over the land of Galilee into Judea, that's when the Pharisee party really gains a lot of membership into the Great Sanhedrin because of the Galilee. So once again, you think like sort of north and south. Galilee's north. They were fairly moderate in the north. And the Pharisees are the moderate party. That's another thing a lot of people don't understand. We would think of them as conservative in American politics because of the whole conservation of religious values and things like that. But they, for their time, were considered moderates. And the zealots would actually be the conservative extremists, give or take. Conservative / extremists. The Essenes were really the true conservatives without the extremism, like the zealot style extremism. And then the Sadducees were very liberal, very inclusive, and by that I mean like assimilative.
Much more given to multiculturalism.
They were pro assimilation into Hellenism. And they were the aristocrats. That's another difference too, is that the Pharisees represented the working class.
Yes.
That's why they had such popularity among common people, because they themselves were usually working class, middle to lower class people themselves. They were just highly educated. The Sadducees were all aristocrats. Most of them were because they were priests, and priests are aristocratic. That is a lineage. That's something that you inherit.
Mm-hmm.
And there's money in inheritance like that, especially working for the temple. And priests got to be immaculate. They gotta look good. They can't have any flaws, physical flaws, features, facial flaws, anything like that. They have to actually look very good. Perfect in order to work at the temple. So they spent a lot of time in the aristocracy, taking care of themselves, bathing, keeping their face clean, being well trimmed and washing their clothes. And that's expensive. That takes money to continue to live that kind of lifestyle. That's why, most celebrities tend to be, pretty people, because they can afford to look that way. So that's the Sadducees were the aristocratic people, but they were also pro-Hellenism, funny enough, even though they have lineage to the Kohanim priests. So let's see.
I say that was part of the dispute with the Hasmoneans, is that the Zadokite priesthood was pro-Hellenism, which is why the Hasmoneans had to take over the priesthood.
And that's the thing too, is the Pharisees. There might have been a couple of Kohanim in the Pharisees. You know, it's not just because you're a Kohen doesn't mean you can't be a Pharisee, and you have to be a Sadducee. But they weren't as popular, you know. And the Pharisees, because they have no real say to the lineage of the high priesthood, they couldn't just usurp it and overthrow it, even though they disagreed heavily with what they were doing, because that was their birthright. So the Pharisees are, again, sort of known as moderates. They're actually okay with the Sadducees being in the priestly positions. You know, they sort of earned it, and it's fine as long as we can maintain, separation of powers, which that is a big thing. Is the separation of powers is something that the Pharisees heavily believed in. What powers? The high priest and the kingship. The Pharisees did not like the idea of the high priesthood and the kingship being so close. That the two powers should be incredibly separated and limited in such a way that one can't really affect the other or have control over, that the high priest can't really sway domain over the king, and vice versa, that the separation of church and state, so to speak, for lack of a better set of, that the separation should be very clear and very evident, so that the high priest can do his religious duties. And, you know, he can be a figure, a celebrity, he can be influential, but he doesn't actually really contain any real power. But the king has real power, but he's also not a priest, so he can't control religious life. You know, he's very much more of a diplomat for foreign relations rather than a domestic policymaker. And the high priest would be more of a domestic policy sort of influencer, but he can't influence domestic foreign relations at all.
Yeah,
that was the Pharisees' sort of way that things should be done. Now the Sadducees, of course, they didn't believe that at all. They liked the idea of large government power versus the Pharisees' sort of smaller governmental power. The Pharisees believed in a death penalty, but they did not like it at all. And the Sadducees, on the other hand, they were all about it.
Off with their heads, right?
Yeah. And so that's another one. Again, they're like the moderates. The Pharisees really are all about maintaining peace, especially peace in the home, right? As in the local Jewish populace, Judea. Peace in the home, even because the reason I'm saying that in quotes is because Shalom Bayit is a real concept that is a branch that stems from Phariseeism about the relationship between a husband and a wife and maintaining peace in the actual literal home. But these things bleed into the other world too. So I have been talking for 29 minutes straight nearly, and I know you got notes, so let's hear them.
Do I? No, I honestly, I thought that the preface of the political background and the political structure of the Pharisee movement and the Sadducee movement is probably a really important thing to establish, because it actually gives further explanation to a lot of the disputes that we see happen throughout the New Testament, and it hones in exactly how much these two sects didn't like each other, which is something that's important to understand, because I know that growing up in church, I was never taught that there was a difference. Actually, the way that I was taught was more or less that these two groups were the difference in title was almost pointless, because they were treated as though they were colleagues and friends of one another on a regular day-to-day basis, which is why they both hated Yeshua so much, right? And that's the idea that gets presented. So understanding the political structure and the political schism between the two, you know, the idea of the Pharisees taking a much more, I would almost dare say, libertarian stance. And and the Sadducees being kind of like, taking like your radical leftist big government, we like telling everybody what to do stance is
Yeah, absolutely. 'Cause, and I actually have it in my notes here. Individual liberty and piety is one of the Pharisees' main focus.
Yep.
But this like individualism is actually something that is fairly unique to the Pharisees for their time. And understand also that this system of governance is incredibly modern. Which
Right.
maybe can compare it to our own Supreme Court system because it actually very much is like that. Um,
Well, I mean, as much as people hate to admit it, the American Constitution is predicated on what the founding fathers could derive from the Bible. And
even more
looking
than the
into the
Bible.
beliefs of the founding fathers, it alone is fascinating. You'd be surprised to know how many of them were not Trinitarian.
But even not the Bible alone, like Thomas Jefferson, obviously the author of the Declaration. He A lot of people don't know this. He could speak fluently in many ancient dead languages, to include Greek, Koine Greek, and Hebrew, and by and large, some Aramaic, if I'm not mistaken. To the point that Thomas Jefferson was a Talmud studier. He had studied Talmud. He was familiar with Talmudic literature. He was also able to read anything written by Socrates in its original format. Jefferson was an incredibly brilliant man. He had a very vast library. Jefferson once was quoted, "I could not live without books," and I vibe very hard with that. Jefferson's my spirit animal.
Absolutely. So, no, I think this is good information to go over and I'm going to be honest, is even though I've got notes, like a lot of this I wasn't even aware of, so I'm learning tonight.
Ah.
Um, which is good. I enjoy opportunities to learn, because most of my knowledge of the Pharisees would mostly be their religious position,
Mm.
because that's what I study the most, particularly because that's the topic of a book that we're writing right now.
Right. Just before we get into the religious aspects, that's our next point, actually. I got two more bits here, and then we're done with the political spectrum. The Pharisees were the only ones of their day that believed in a very foundational principle that America believes in as well, and that is precedent for case law.
Yes.
The Pharisees were the only ones. So a lot of the times when you hear things like the traditions of the elders being spoken of in the New Testament, they are oftentimes not necessarily referring to the oral traditions, like passed down to Moses from Sinai. Sometimes they are just referring to a precedent set from case law.
Yep.
A particular case was oversought by the Great Sanhedrin. And then once they made a ruling that set a precedent, and so further rulings would be based off of that precedent. And the Pharisees were very big on this. A lot of Pharisees themselves, we would know today as lawyers because they were very good at law and they
Yes.
believed in case law. In fact, many Pharisees were, in fact, lawyers. Pharisees, like heads of the synagogues, the tribunal, they would all be basically lawyers, and sometimes they were called actually lawyers. Paul calls a few of his own fellow Pharisees lawyers. He sends some letters away to different communities with a lawyer. So a fellow Pharisee, a recognized member of the Chevarim. So that is the really one of the biggest things. And even though they were opposed to Hellenism, they were not against working in relation to Hellenists. And
Right.
once again, the Sadducees are all about full integration, basically undoing everything that the Maccabees fought for. Whereas the Pharisees were like, well, hold on. But also because they weren't aristocrats, they were not really swayed very easily into Hellenism because they were boots on the ground very often, still with the people who valued the traditions and the religious life. from that. So that's the biggest point I want to hit, is the precedence in case law. Excuse me. So that's unique to them, and that was really the main point. So it's not every time you see traditions of the elders, we're talking about the oral law. Sometimes we're talking about case law, which, according to case law, essentially, once it has been made case law and it sets a precedent, it is treated like it is oral law, like it's basically Torah, barring the fact that it can still be undone by the Great Sanhedrin, but it can only ever be undone by the Great Sanhedrin. They're the only ones who can undo a precedent like that. And so, keeping in mind, this is a political entity. So when Pharisees make a ruling on a thing, they have that kind of sway and authority over people back then. Whereas, today, if your pastor says you can't mix meat and dairy, you can go home and go, I don't care what the pastor says. But back then, that was not a decision you could be making. Pharisees, or if Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, what have you, even the lesser Sanhedrin would make a law, and it would be treated as though it were law here in America. The speed limit is now 55, whether you like it or not. That's the speed limit, and that's the way it was treated. It's not strictly like it is today, where it's just religious. It has nothing to do legality speaking.
Yeah, no, it would have been the equivalent of like if today the average modern pastor were also a constitutional law professor.
Correct.
Right. That's what it would that would be an equivalent.
And your local church would be allowed to make local laws.
Right.
And your local church also funded the police station and would enforce said laws that they would put in place. So whether you liked those laws or not, if you didn't like not mixing your meat and dairy, you could be legally held liable for things that would be against the law. Now, of course, the meat and dairy thing it's just a weird example, as it really wouldn't be enforced that way. But that's an example. That's the kind of power and sway. This is not strictly a religious problem. This is, in fact, very political. And that's why, we can't stress enough understanding the level of political involvement with this religious system. It's more than just a religious sect of Judaism. It has no bearing on the government. It is the government. So now, with that out of the way, let's talk about the theologies of the Pharisees.
Well, and this is one thing that I find interesting about the Pharisee beliefs. So everybody knows the resurrection is a point of disagreement between the Pharisees and Sadducees. But the Pharisees placed a particular emphasis on free will, right? Mm-hmm. They believed in free will, the idea that humans had free will. And I don't know that that's the same for the Sadducees. I think they may have actually taken a much more determinist position.
Well, so the Sadducees believed in only free will. According to Josephus, the Sadducees did not have a concept of fate in any way. That is to say that, like, a Pharisee would say that there's certain things that are destined by God, right? Coming to Messiah, certain stuff like that.
And then divine intervention, things like that.
Yeah, they believed in a sort of determinism and free will kind of together. They didn't see a contradiction between the two. The Sadducees were free will only. There's no such thing as fate. There's no such thing as a divine intervention. None of that is the way that works. There are no fixed points in time. Doctor Who reference for those of you.
The paradoxes resolve themselves by and large.
And the Essenes, on the other end of that, only believed in determinism and had no concept of free will at all. So the Pharisees, again, are the moderate party here, where they have a combination of the two.
Yep. And I think what's fascinating about that, the Sadducee position being one of no divine intervention is like, well, how, like, because they accepted the written Torah, right? So how do you explain the Exodus?
You know what? Let me put it this way: the modern Karaites are based off of a medieval rebirthing of the Sadducean theology. But much like Reformed Judaism today, you could say that the Sadducees maybe more like conservative Judaism, did believe that, God sort of inserted himself at like Sinai, and then like that's it. But even then, the immutability of the Torah could be called into question. Whereas in the Pharisees' mind, that's not a thing. The same Torah we have today is the same Torah Moses gave. They're perfect. There's no difference. Whereas the Sadducees, I don't know this for a fact, but I think that they would be more willing to say that it was more of a traditional thing being passed down from ages ago, but it's not necessarily, um, set in stone, so to speak, or even divinely inspired. Because once again, they don't even really have a sense of fate. So even a messianic redemption, which is a fixed point in time in rabbinic Judaism, is not a thing for them.
Yep. Yep. And so along with the resurrection, then, right? Because
Yes.
the idea of the resurrection is entirely dependent on the idea of the immortality of the soul, which the Sadducees also did not believe in.
Correct. According to Josephus, once again, a lot of this information, by the way, is coming from Antiquities, Book 18, chapters 1 and 2. It's kind of all over the place, all the way through like chapter 5. But Book 18, chapter 1, I got one here. The Pharisees believed in the immortality of the soul. And I can just read a short paragraph here. The souls have an immortal rigor in them, and that under the earth they were rewarded or punished according to the virtuous or vicious lives that they lived. The latter they determined to be in an everlasting prison, and the former have the power to revive and live again. So that is to say that the Pharisees did, according to Josephus, believe in eternal punishment for vicious people and a resurrection for good people. And next episode, we'll actually go into like who qualifies for what, who believed in what particularly, because there are subsects within Phariseeism that have differing views on that statement alone. Yeah. Sadducees did not have the idea of an immortal soul. The soul died with the body.
Somebody got the references.
You see, yes. So, so the immortality of the soul. What else? What else did you have?
Well, so, and this goes into kind of the lavish lifestyle that the Sadducees afforded for themselves. Is the idea of divine reward and punishment. Because if you don't believe in an afterlife, then naturally there is no reward and punishment, because there's no afterlife for that to even take place in.
Right.
And this is why they considered the Pharisees, and I've said this before, but like they considered the Pharisees to have been putting themselves through like undue hardship. Like you guys make your lives too hard on yourself when you don't have to. And I think a lot of that is because understanding, first of all, that the Pharisees were Torah teachers, but also typically would have a trade. You know, they had an occupation that they worked in. Like Paul was a tent maker. Yeshua was a carpenter, or a stone worker would be like a better idea of what that is.
He's in Israel.
Right.
So he's likely a stonemason.
Yeah. And Hillel would have been the same, and Shammai was a builder, you could say.
Yeah, he an architect, I think he was, which is why he carried a cubit stick with him everywhere he went.
And then I think Ramban was a physician.
Yes,
as I understand, he was a medical doctor.
That's technically rabbinic Judaism, because that's 10th, 11th century.
Sure.
Which is born from Phariseeism.
So basically, what that tells us is that this tradition of of at least the more rabbinically minded, right, the outgrowth that came from Phariseeism, the tradition of them having a position as a teacher, as well as a profession that they worked in on a day-to-day basis, that lived well up into the 11th century would have been Ramban's time,
even to this very day. You can find it in Pirkei Avot. But yeah, a lot of rabbinic Judaism is born straight out of Pharisaic Judaism, with some caveats to that. They're not the same exactly today. That's another thing I want to make clear real quick. Pharisee Judaism in the first century is not the same as it is today. Today, at post Second Temple destruction, rabbinic Judaism sort of locked down and into a particular way of Phariseeism, where traditionally Phariseeism is not a monolith. It's actually rather fluid and
Right.
malleable in certain areas. But after the destruction of the Second Temple, it sort of forced Judaism to kind of pick one and lock it in. And so it's not the same, largely for that reason. But a lot of modern rabbinic Judaism is basically Hillelite Judaism in a lot of ways,
Right.
in most ways, but not all ways. That's just something I want to make clear. But yeah. And we actually had a special fact we wanted to go over about because Pharisees were called rabbis, and you wanted to talk about the first Pharisee to be called rabbi.
Well, yeah, the first person, historically speaking, to ever been called rabbi, and I think it's Eliyahu Tzvi Soloveitchik who builds a case for this, is Yeshua. Right.
Yes.
That's I mean, and that's an Orthodox Jewish source recognizing that if you go back in history as far as you can go to figure out who the first person ever was referred to as rabbi, it's Yeshua in the Gospels. That's it.
As like a title, yeah. And the thing is, too, I should note that's historically. We can't confirm that he's the absolute first.
Right.
But historically, as far as we're able to tell, he is the first because he's the only one we can prove that he's the first. So,
right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that being the case, the fact that it became, or that it was, such a ubiquitous thing in the Pharisee movement, again, this just lends to the pile of evidence that there is that Yeshua himself was a Pharisee.
And there's a lot of, we've talked about that a lot on this channel. More to come. The Pharisees were also known as being charismatic teachers. So we can get into their methods, actually. They're very charismatic. They're known for this. They connected really well with people. And they spoke largely in parables or in midrash. They had the Pardes style of study is a Pharisee invention.
Yep.
And the idea of using a story too to really connect with people and to have like a very charismatic way of interacting with the common populace is a fairly strictly a Pharisee practice. There are a lot of people who fit this bill perfectly. Paul of Tarsus, who we know for a fact was a Pharisee by his own admission, and Jesus, of course.
Right. James even. It just is what it is. It's
the thing is, the Pharisees were not hated. Everyone loved the Pharisees. They were so popular with the people. Even Josephus writing on them, same book, 18, chapter 1, section 3. They perform all of their everything. So it's talking about like the duties, prayer, doctrines, divine worship, sacrifices. They perform them according to their direction, insomuch that the cities give great attestations to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and also their discourses. They were loved by the people. This is your local pastor, or we're talking about like the youth pastor that everyone knows and loves. He's a great guy. He's super smart. Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that's a stigma that needs to go away. Because again, I can remember growing up, the way that the Pharisees are portrayed is such that like the common people felt that they were like these taskmasters lording over them, cracking the whip for the this extreme legalistic
Oppressive,
strict
hypocritical.
observance of Torah law. And that's what the people were in need of deliverance from, and that's why Yeshua was such a breath of fresh air with his anti-Torah, anti-Pharisee message. That's how it's treated in church, and it's like, no, that's not what it's like.
I've said it 100 times, and I'll say it again. The fact that people use the term Pharisee in a pejorative manner is indicative of the fact that they don't understand what a Pharisee is.
Right. Yep. Yeah, that's I saw a post the other day, warning, beware of Pharisees, and I was like, well, I don't know if anybody is well educated or well versed enough in Torah today to actually call themselves that, but we can all hope to attain that level.
Yeah. Yeah, but people call me a Pharisee all the time. They're like, "You're just a Pharisee." And I'm like, "Don't you ever give me an honor I did not
I've not earned it.
Like, I act offended, but then anyway. So, but no, they were very virtuous people. They were known for being virtuous, as opposed to the Sadducees, who were aristocratic. They were the whiny, privileged class. They were.
The Pharisees were the grassroots movement of Judaism at that time.
It's really funny you say that, because that is the exact words of some of the scholars I've been reading for the source material. Particularly like people like Harvey Falk, Jacob Emden would say things like, yeah, they were the grassroots of the people on the ground. Yeah, Jacob Emden, he said something like that. Because we know that Jacob Emden had a lot to say to Christians about Judaism. But anyway, yeah, so that's some of their methods. And what really shined throughout all this too is that every other sect of Judaism at this time was very much centered around the temple system, very land centered, because it was more of a geopolitical thing than it was a religious political thing in some of their minds. So keeping in mind that this is all geopolitical, religious politics all together, like there's no separating them. But one of the key differences is the Sadducees only exist when there's a temple and there's a land of Israel, because they were not religious. In fact, many of them were just non-religious at all. And that's another telling feature. The Pharisees are known for being very religious, and the Sadducees are not. They're just not religious. And so the success of rabbinic Judaism actually hinges on the idea that the Pharisees would go into the diaspora and connect with the people and basically teach that Judaism doesn't need a temple to be Judaism. You can be a temple for yourself. And so it doesn't matter that you live in Rome. Be a temple for yourself. If you can make it out, great. But if not, it's fine. And that's what led to the success of Judaism in the diaspora, particularly, is thanks to the Pharisees, which again, that becomes rabbinic Judaism. And that's why rabbinic Judaism continues even to this day, is because the focus is no longer on the temple. It's about individual piety. It's about religious individuality, prayer life, spiritual purity, morality. These are all Pharisee values. These are not values of Sadducees, not even really values necessarily of Zealots or even some Essenes. Essenes were incredibly pious, don't get me wrong. But again, they cease to exist because without a temple, they don't really have a reason to exist. They're sort of just seen as super strict Pharisees after that.
Well, and the Essenes were already kind of on their way out the door in that century anyway. They were already a minority who was dwindling and dying more or less.
They were a little too not orthodox, but like ultra. They were too what's the word? United States before it entered World War II. Seclusionist.
Oh, isolationist.
Isolationist. They were too isolationists, and that was sort of their downfall.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's hard to maintain an entire sect of unmarried men who keep the world at arm's length.
You can't even shake hands with a stranger, let alone, you know, anybody. You can't poop on Shabbos. Like, there's all sorts of stuff that they it's just a little too extreme for a lot of people. It was doomed from the beginning, more or less.
Yeah.
But yeah, it should be noted that they did have a big focus on individual piety. Now, if you only read the New Testament, you would gather from just the New Testament, if that was your only exposure to Judaism, that all Pharisees loved to pray out loud. They were all about being flashy and showing themselves off and sitting at the seat of honor. They only really cared about external appearances. That's actually, from the historians, higher perspective, looking down on the whole thing as a whole, that's mostly true of the Sadducees. And it's only true of a particular sect of Pharisees, which we'll get into next episode when it comes to Shammai and Hillel. But the Pharisees were known everywhere else except for a select few areas in a very particular time in Jewish history for like 30 years at most. They were very, they were the ones teaching people to go into the closets and pray, not out loud, to wear small phylacteries, to kind of do everything on a much more individual for yourself. You're not doing it for others, unless it's something to be done for others, such as your neighbor's donkey in a ditch kind of thing. They focused heavily on prayer life, which again, not something that the Sadducees ever did. So yeah, that we are at 58 minutes.
I was going to say, yeah, we can open up the chat for questions at this point and begin the closeout.
Yeah, I was going to say it. So that's all. That's it for my notes. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say. So yeah, let's go ahead and chat. Ask the questions. And this was the final banner, the beginnings of Rabbinic Judaism, and I already covered that. I just forgot to put it up.
Well, we can go over. We didn't quite touch on this.
You're correct.
This is important.
Take it away.
Well, yeah. So from what we can gather from all of the gospel accounts collectively, is that there either weren't any, or at the very best, only a small handful of Pharisees at the trial of Yeshua. This is something that took place secretly in the middle of the night on purpose. So it was not a full Sanhedrin that was there present for this meeting.
In fact, it's Luke's gospel that indicates to us, and he later gives us another indication in the book of Acts, that only the Sadducees were present at his trial. There are other clues that give this away. Gamliel seems to be very much in favor of the Jesus movement in its early stages. If not in favor, at the very least tolerant of, because again, Pharisees are actually fairly moderate, largely speaking. But the fact that Yeshua is falsely charged with the crime of treason, essentially, and they label it as blasphemy, but they're charging him with treason for claiming to be Messiah, which is a threat only to Roman authority. And the Sadducees are bought and paid for by Rome, inserted as basically a puppet governance to have control over the Jewish people at some capacity without being overt about it. And we're pro-Hellenistic assimilation. And so, yeah, a messianic claimant was to be put to death at the behest of Rome, and the Sadducees that was their job.
And one of the other evidences, and this is an interesting one that I stumbled across in my research of the topic that I've been looking into lately, is the specific mention of false witnesses, right? Witnesses who came and gave false testimony of something they clearly never saw, something that was scripted or something like that. That is actually mentioned in the Talmud as being a characteristic of the Sadducees and Boethusians. They apparently had a habit of utilizing false witnesses in the Sanhedrin. So again, the mention of this and the fact that there seems to be no opposition to it is an indication that, again, there were either no Pharisees at this trial, which is that's the most likely option,
Right.
or there were such a small handful that it was insignificant and their vote was never going to matter in the first place.
Yeah. There may have been some Pharisees that were siding with Sadducees, in which case they would not have voiced up at all, but fairly unlikely, particularly on the night of Passover. uh, so anyway, yeah, there's a lot of, in fact, First Fruits of Zion kind of has a good thing about it in some of their commentaries here, where they go into greater detail on that. We don't have time for that today, but yeah. Um, Interesting username. Do you believe the Pharisees and Sadducees were good or bad people? So since you went first last time, I'll go first this time. By and large, I would say that the Pharisees were, by and large, again, according to Josephus, even very good people, very virtuous. Not just anybody became a Pharisee. These were upstanding citizens of some of the highest caliber of people. And the Sadducees were not universally hated, but especially amongst the common people, they were seen as sort of kind of traitors because of their loyalty to Hellenism, to being bought by Rome, their support of Herod, versus the Pharisees would work with Herod, but they weren't in support of him. The Pharisees actually refused to swear loyalty to Herod. So, yeah, by and large, but of course there are always exceptions to the rule. So don't make this me saying all Pharisees are good. That's not true, and all Sadducees are bad. That's also not true. This is general, broad brush, sweeping generalizations.
Right. Here's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Could Rabbi Akiva have been part of the Sanhedrin during the time of Yeshua? No. Rabbi Akiva was born in the latter half of the first century, going into the second century. So Rabbi Akiva might, when he was a young man, might have been a contemporary of the Apostle John when John was an old man. Right? That's their paths may have crossed, or at least they would have existed in the same time frame when the Apostle John, right, the youngest apostle, was a very man and Rabbi Akiva man at that point.
Yeah, Rabbi Akiva, he was part of a Sanhedrin, but not this Sanhedrin.
Right.
And then, of course, Gamliel of Yavna, when the Sanhedrin moves to Yavna post the second Jewish revolt, which failed, which Akiva died in.
So to be a Pharisee does not mean that you are a member of the Sanhedrin, right? To be a member of the Sanhedrin is a very specific position. To be a Pharisee is to hold a specific ideology, right?
Think of it as a political party rather than a, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, kind of like we have some Supreme Court judges who are Republicans and some who are Democrats, right? But to be a Republican or a Democrat doesn't mean that you're automatically on the Supreme Court.
Right.
So works the same way here.
By and large, Pharisees, so like maybe at Jesus' level for Yeshua, he may have been recognized as only really having authority in his local tribunal at his hometown, and that's it. And then from there, you could possibly be elected to the Lesser Sanhedrin, and then from there, the Lesser Sanhedrin could appoint you as a member to the Great Sanhedrin. But yeah, and that's actually why, because a lot of people have said this was a common objection. If Jesus is a Pharisee, then why did no one in the Sanhedrin recognize Jesus? And it's because he was not a member of the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is an incredibly exclusive club, the Great Sanhedrin anyway, and he was likely only a local leader of his particular tribunal, teaching at his synagogue for this small community.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not that they weren't recognizing him as not having ever been a Pharisee. It's more that they just literally don't know who he is. He's from a no-name town, Nazareth. It's not even on a map. Like if you look at an ancient map of Israel, it's not even there. An ancient map. Like obviously, if you Google and you'll find a modern rendition of the ancient Israel. I'm talking like ancient drawn up maps. Nazareth isn't even on the map. It's a no-name town. So it's likely that he was just a no-name because he was nobody special. He was nobody, he wasn't Paul of Tarsus, right? Paul of Tarsus was likely on his way to Jerusalem to accept a position in the Great Sanhedrin. Like that, people know who he is. He's a big name. He's a student of Gamaliel, who is a current sitting member of the Sanhedrin. Like, that's big name stuff. Yeshua did not have that kind of popularity.
Right. But we are now almost 7 minutes past the hour. So I think we can kind of begin to wrap this up and look forward to next week. Next week is we're going to be talking around the same topic, but we'll get a little bit more in detail next week and look forward to that. It's going to be a good time. Again, don't forget that we've got a book club starting and the monthly book giveaway that will be taking place in March. So if you win this month's book giveaway, you'll be ready for the book club that will be happening in March.
The idea is, because it's January's giveaway, so it will be given away at the end of January, which means you'll get it early February, which gives you plenty of time so that when March comes around, you can actually read it for March. That's why we've done that. So it's a couple months ahead, but it's really only 1 month in advance.
Absolutely. And other than that, other quick announcements that we already went through these. But next week I will be doing an interview with Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. Really looking forward to that. We've got a lot of great things coming your way. We're in a bit of small expansion right now, and I'm super stoked to see what the future holds. We do have to do meme of the week before we close it out, though.
You know what I was thinking is because we talked so hard on political stuff. You
want to choose one of the more political memes?
There's a political one out here. Do you want to use it?
Go for it.
Oh man, there's actually a couple of good ones. I'm feeling froggy today. Let's use this one. It's funny that, of course, the commenter is the winner, actually.
Of course.
So let me, I have to set it up here. Excuse me while I minimize some stuff so I can do this. Oh, yes. Here we go. Did I freeze yet?
Not yet.
Okay, good. I wish I had remembered to do this so I wouldn't be waiting. All right, and here we go. That's the one. Super edgy. I don't care. I think it's funny.
Where's the lie, though?
Given the fact that we've talked a lot of politics here today, I think this. So, tea with Kara. Congratulations.
You are this week's Baal Hamimim.
You are the Baal Hamimim this week. All right, how do I get rid of this? There we go. Okay, so I think that's everything. There it is again. I got nothing else. I think we're good. Oh, all right. Don't forget After Pardes in the Discord. Link in the description below. After Pardes is for the Patreon supporters. Or any of the supporters on the website or the Patreon at any level, access to exclusive content and the post-show Pardes where we talk about stuff or sit in awkward silence or get roasted, whichever it is you want to do. You pay for that time. It's totally yours. And we're going to head into that now at the end of the show. So if you want to be there, please consider supporting the channel. And if not, join the Discord anyway. We're on there all the time. We're always answering people's questions. We have plenty of instructors that are alternate media approved instructors that are more than willing to answer your questions from all sorts of backgrounds, ranging from the Messianic background or the Orthodox Jewish background. We have it. So there it is. There's the Patreon link. Again, all this is in the description below with thealternatemedia.com. That's ALTAR, alternatemedia.com. All right. Now that's it. That's all the stuff. Finally, the announcements. We need to like just pre-record all the announcements and play them in the intro so we can just stop talking all the time and forgetting all the time.
Always. It's such a burden. But we do hope that you enjoyed tonight's episode. We hope that you have learned something or that you gleaned something from it. And if you would like to see more of this kind of content, please like and subscribe, ring that bell, and we hope to see you next time. L'chaim.
L'chaim.